Hi, my name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Scholarly Director of the McCormick Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie University. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're based in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Thanks to everyone for tuning in to join our live stream this evening. First, I'd like to bring to your attention some new materials on the McCormick Institute website about scenario planning. We do a lot of work on risk governance at the Institute. We're particularly interested in low probability, high impact events like a pandemic. In the spirit of helping public policymakers, we've made some new materials available today on our website with respect to scenario planning. Scenario planning is a recommended exercise for those organizations addressing uncertain times and emerging risks. We've added to our website a 20-minute video to introduce some tools and techniques for scenario planning. We've also added a brief guide for those who are new to scenario planning and a more detailed study for those who are interested. You can find all these materials at dal.ca/MIPP. If you have any comments about the materials, please email them to us at mipp@dal.ca. Next week on May 12th, we'll be hosting a panel on the impacts of COVID-19 on tourism in Atlantic Canada. A typical year in Atlantic Canada sees over 7 million visitors to the 4 Atlantic provinces, bringing in over $5.2 billion in revenue. Experts are expecting a significant drop this year due to the travel restrictions imposed to control the spread of COVID-19. With an expert group of academics and practitioners to join us next week to discuss the challenges facing the tourism industry in the Atlantic region in the coming months and share perspectives on the proposed government policies and programs that have been announced recently. And on May 14th, which is also next week, so it's unusual, we have 2 events next week. We have another event on May 14th. We're partnering with the Healthy Populations Institute and Dalhousie alumni for a panel on public health and built environments. This panel will feature a group of experts from the university, as well as the public service, to offer perspectives on how the public can engage with built and natural environments in the coming weeks, and how policymakers can create space for that engagement in post-pandemic life. For all of our panels, as is our custom at the McCormick Institute, we will be exploring the issues, options, and policy responses for these sectors. In addition to the upcoming panels, we have a collection of expert policy discussions on our website and our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to view them and share the romantic images some may have about the fishing sector in the Maritimes. Those who know the sector best know that it is a remarkably complex one, which has many moving parts, including catching, processing, transportation networks, inshore fishing fleets, outshore fishing fleets. There are large and small enterprises and a variety of species and markets. COVID-19 has generated significant challenges with respect to addressing workplace safety, coordinating a response across this complex sector, and responding to the significant drop in demand at home and abroad. The fisheries is an important sector for Atlantic Canada today and for the future. We will try to address some of the pressing issues. There is no doubt with the limited time that we have, we will not get to all of them, but we'll do the best we can to get as many of the questions in as we can and address as many of your concerns as we can. I will introduce all 4 speakers at once, and then each will have about 10 minutes to provide the opening comments, as I said. After our 4th speaker, we'll invite you to ask your questions. And as I say, if you can direct the questions to one speaker in particular, we'd appreciate it. And the questions should go to mipp@dal.ca or by commenting on the Facebook video. Our first speaker is Rick Williams. Rick Williams is a sole proprietor of Praxis Research and Consulting. He's the author of A Future of the Fishery, Crisis and Renewal in Canada's Neglecting Fishery Industry, and a research director at the Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters. From 2009 to 2013, Rick Williams was Deputy Minister to the Premier for Policy and Priorities in the Government of Nova Scotia. He also served as a faculty member at Dalhousie University from 1976 to 1994. After Rick, we'll be joined by Jessica McCormick. Jessica is the Director of Public Affairs for the Fish, Food, and Allied Workers Union, the largest private sector union in Newfoundland and Labrador, representing workers in the fishery industry. Jessica holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Memorial University and more than a decade of experience in government relations and strategic communications. She served on various nonprofit boards, including the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She currently serves on the board of directors of Oxfam Canada. Geoff Irvine will be our next speaker. Geoff Irvine has held the position of Executive Director of the Lobster Council of Canada since its inception in 2010. He has 25 years of experience in all facets of the international seafood industry, including retail for fresh and frozen seafood products, food service, raw material inspection, sales, marketing, international trading, and business management. Geoff has developed his knowledge of the seafood industry in small and large company settings with both inshore and offshore focus. He's a proud Atlantic Canadian. He grew up in Digby, Nova Scotia, attended Acadia and Dalhousie University, and he and his partner Julie have 3 kids. Susanna Fuller will be our 4th speaker. Susanna Fuller is the Vice President of Operations and Projects for Oceans North. Susanna's commitment to the marine conservation was born during her final year of high school when she spent 6 months on a tall ship during the same period when northern cod stocks collapsed in Atlantic Canada. Her work now focuses on achieving tangible conservation outcomes in sustainable fisheries and spatial protections in Atlantic Canada and the Arctic, as well as initiatives to protect high seas biodiversity. She completed her PhD at Dalhousie University, including research on North Atlantic marine sponge populations, and has worked for the past decade and a half on the science policy interface for national and international fisheries and ocean conservation. I'd like to welcome the 4 speakers. I'd like to thank them for sharing their insights with us this evening. And on that, I will now turn it over to Rick Williams, our first speaker. Rick.
Evan, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important event. I'm going to kind of build on Kevin's introduction by providing a bigger picture of what the fishery is, what the fishing economy is, and what's been going on in the fishery for the last 10 years or so. So I'm going to try to switch over to some PowerPoints here. And okay, so to start out with, what is the fishing economy? The Atlantic Canada fishery generated about $3.7 billion in landed value. That's revenues to fishing enterprises in 2018. And that led to about 4.7 billion in export earnings for the region in 2019. The fishery generates about 60,000 jobs and about 1.6 billion in employment earnings in coastal communities across the region. About 31,000 of those jobs are in fish harvesting that generates $1 billion or so in harvester incomes, and a bit less, fewer jobs, 29,000 in fish processing, and 565 million in workers' income. So a substantial industry impacting rural coastal communities. The fishery is unique in 2 major respects. One is it's an industry that begins with the harvest of wild animals from marine environments. So built into the very structure and nature of the industry is that the harvesters and the industry itself are the stewards of the resource and are responsible in the management of fisheries for sustaining fisheries, fish stocks, fish resources. And as we would all know, this has been a learning process over the last 20 or 30 years with some ups and downs. But I would like to think that we are much further advanced down that road in developing industrial stewardship. The second major characteristic of the fishery is that it's gone through an extraordinary period of economic expansion over the last 10 years, coming out of the 2007-2009 global recession. So just to illustrate the scale of that growth, we in 2018 landed 100,000 tons less fish out of the ocean than we did in 2010. So a 13% reduction in actual products. That would normally signal a downturn in the fishing in an industry economy. But in the case of the fishery, the opposite occurred. In spite of that 13% decline in landings, the earnings to fishing enterprises went up, what we call landed value, went up by 77% from 2 billion to 3.6 billion. And the value of exports went up 72% from 2.5 billion to $4.4 billion. So what that tells us is that we are not growing the fishery by putting more and more pressure on the resource, although Susanna will provide some important detail about some problem areas in that regard. But generally speaking, the growth spurt that we've gone through in the fishery is as a result of what's going on in the marketplace. And that has meant that the fishery has become the most dynamic economic sector in the Atlantic region. Over the 2010 to 2019 period, seafood exports grew by over 80% in value, whereas all other sectors went up only 8%. So about the value of exports from the seafood sector grew at about 10 times the rate of the economy overall. In Nova Scotia, seafood exports went up by over 125% compared to a 6% decline in the value of exports across the rest of the economy. And over that period in Nova Scotia, the share of overall exports for the fishing industry went from 17% to 35%. So it's now the leading export sector in the Nova Scotia economy. The question one might ask then, is that just a blip? Is that, the kind of boom bust cycle that we often see in resource industries? We're making the argument in our research that no, this is potentially a sustainable trend over the foreseeable future. And again, taking, or if we can assume for the moment that we're able to manage fish stocks on a sustainable basis, what the industry begins with a resource base that cannot be expanded. We will produce a limited and not fixed, but fairly constant supply of product to the marketplace. So we can't grow the industry by producing more fish. We shouldn't try to grow the industry by producing larger quantities of products. What we should focus on is maintaining, sustaining, conserving those products, and then building their value in the marketplace, because the dynamism is all coming from the marketplace. The fishery has historically been a globalized industry, but never more so than in the last 20, 30 years. With our new trade agreement with Europe, with the expansion of trade with China, the rising middle class in Asia who are more fish consumers, with changing consumer tastes in North America and interest in seafood as a healthier choice. All of those things have combined to drive up demand for seafood products. And so the kind of formula that we use to predict a growth future is a fixed supply with growing demand. And the consequence of that almost inevitably needs to be continuing growth in the market value of seafood products. And that we believe will continue to drive the growth of the industry overall. Before the pandemic crisis came along, there were certain barriers to realizing this growth potential on a continuing basis. The first one would be that what I would consider to be a longstanding policy of kind of benign neglect with regard to the fishery. The fishery has not been perceived in federal or provincial governments as a strategic sector, as a high priority sector, and has been kind of left alone in a lot of ways. Now, we have seen some improvement in that outlook, that policy perspective in the last couple of years with the Atlantic Fisheries Fund, the new Fisheries Act. COA has been paying much more attention to the fishery, but generally the long-term trend has been that the fishery is pretty much left alone. I guess we have a pretty interesting indication of that just today when the Prime Minister announces a $200 million targeted program for the agriculture sector, addressing on top of the other supports that are there for small business and workers and so on, tailored programs to meet the special needs of the agricultural sector. We are still waiting to see whether anything like that is going to come into place for the fishery outside of the processing sector. So government attention to the industry is one challenge. The industry is facing something of a demographic cliff with an aging workforce, with rural population decline and outmigration. So with that aging workforce, a lot of our workforce, up to 40%, will leave the industry over the next 5 to 10 years. And there aren't the people present in many rural regions to replace them. That's another challenge that needs to be addressed. Along with that goes the fact that some 40% of enterprises, licenses will change hands. And many of the people who work in the industry as young people coming in as crew members and so on, don't generate the kind of incomes to pay to buy the licenses that are changing hands, that are rising very rapidly in value because of the value of the fish in the marketplace. So intergenerational succession is going to be a challenge. And then industry fragmentation. We have the processing sector, we have the harvesting sector. We don't have governance structures that bring the industry together to work together to build the industry into the future, but in particular now, faced with the coronavirus crisis. So to overcome those challenges, we needed government, industry, and federal and provincial governments and industry to come together around a commitment to sustainable development. And then we needed a strategy to pursue that would address the labor force renewal challenges, the access to capital for succession, the governance structures to develop a ocean to plate kind of value chain kind of development, the kind of work that Geoff Irvine is involved in. So given that background, where we had some major challenges 6 months ago before the pandemic crisis hit, what's been the impact? Well, first and foremost, we have widespread destabilization of markets, a virtual shutdown of access to markets in Asia and Europe right now. Some issues are in the United States. So that has created huge uncertainty across the industry. We face a risk of many enterprises across different fleets having little or no income this year if they don't have access to markets. So a large number of small, medium-sized enterprises could be in real trouble in terms of viability and getting through this year into when fisheries start up again. And the processing sector, of course, has been seriously impacted by loss of access to markets and also difficulties finding workers. They've relied heavily on temporary foreign workers who have more difficulty getting into the country. And the safety and health concerns of workers in our local communities has impacted on availability of labor supply. We were in a situation where we had needed to attract more new entrants to the industry, and this year being a down year in terms of incomes and employment opportunities will set us back on that regard. And I think we'll see that there's been some real damage done to kind of industry cohesiveness and cooperation, growing tensions among harvesters groups in different areas and between harvesting and processing sectors. It's right now, it's been a bit of a kind of dog-eat-dog situation out there. And hopefully, we can get past that and start working together. But at the moment, people are under a lot of stress. So my concluding point would be that, like the agriculture industry that we heard about today, the fishery needs its own unique recovery strategy that addresses its own unique potential growth opportunities and its particular challenges, starting with the need to recognize the strategic importance of the industry at the provincial level and regional level, and renewed federal, provincial, and industry collaboration to get us through this year and back onto a growth track again. So the goals of such a strategy would be that we have to come out of this with our fleets, our enterprises intact, ready to go fishing again. 1 to 2 years probably of severe economic stress for a lot of enterprises. And that will require an income security system. I think the EI system is the most efficient way to deliver that. And I'm not hearing a lot of consideration of that option right now. There's going to need to be debt relief. The Nova Scotia Fisheries Loan Board, for example, has held off collecting loan payments until the fall, but they're still going to be there. They're building up. The commercial banks have carry a large part of the loan portfolio for the fishing industry. There'll be some real challenges there. Access to affordable capital to stay in business, there will be a certain number of enterprises changing hands and so on. So that challenge is there. But the biggest issue, of course, will be rebuilding access to markets and value chain collaboration to do that. So with that overview, I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Thanks very much, Rick. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Okay, thanks very much for having me, Kevin. My name is Jessica McCormick. I'm the Director of Public Affairs with the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union in Newfoundland and Labrador. Our union, FFAW, represents nearly 15,000 working women and men throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. Most of our members are employed in the fishing industry. Around 10,000 are fish harvesters, and an additional 3,000 work in fish processing plants, along with some people in other industrial workplaces. FFAW is, for the most part, a rural union. We have members in nearly 500 communities in every region of Newfoundland and Labrador. Most of our members live in relatively small communities of 500 people or less. And many of these communities, similar to other places in Atlantic Canada, have existed for centuries, and all were founded because of the fishery. Without exception, the fishery has and always will be the primary economic driver in small coastal communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, as it is in other parts of Atlantic Canada. COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on our province's fishing industry, like many other sectors across the country and around the world. The seasonal nature of the industry has left it exceptionally hard hit, with many fleets, even in this province, still waiting to hear when or if fisheries will open. In some areas, Canada's fish harvesters may very well have to forego critical fishing seasons this year. We're facing serious market challenges, some of which I know Geoff will speak to later on, that will severely impact incomes for fish harvesters. We're facing shortages of personal protective equipment that must be used in fish processing plants and on fishing vessels. As you can imagine, social isolation is nearly impossible on a 30 or 40-foot fishing boat. I've heard it said that fish harvesters are so close aboard their boats that when they sleep in their bunks, they share the same dreams. In fish processing plants, workers share similar concerns. They're worried about their health and safety and possible exposure to COVID-19, and some feel like they're being forced to choose between their health and a paycheck. And recent outbreaks of COVID-19 in meat processing facilities in Alberta, for example, have not helped to reassure the people working in this sector. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the demographics are such that most of the workers in fish plants are over the age of 50. A majority of them are women, and a number of them suffer from pre-existing conditions known as shellfish asthma, which is a result of years working in processing plants and ingesting the fumes and toxins that are emitted through the shellfish processing process. So this is kind of compounding the concerns and anxieties amongst workers who are preparing to go back into plants or who have just returned to work. One of the key issues our union has raised with respect to safety measures in fish plants has been the need for adequate, standardized, safe operating procedures at all fish plants, and the importance of worker involvement in devising those plans. There have been severe breakdowns in this process in Newfoundland and Labrador this season that have really frustrated workers. Some of these tensions could have been avoided by having provincial governments draft consistent procedures that all processing facilities must adhere to, rather than leaving that process up to the companies themselves. From the perspective of the people working on the water, enterprise owners are seriously concerned about how they'll manage to get through the season and avoid bankruptcy, let alone support their families and the families of their crew members. Many enterprise owners have substantial loans, and at current prices for species such as snow crab and lobster, they may not be able to make those payments this year while covering other expenses. While the federal government introduced income and wage support programs such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, these programs don't exactly align with the realities of our sector. Once fish harvesters start fishing, they'll no longer be eligible for the CERB unless their income is less than $1,000 a month. They also can't qualify for the wage subsidy or loan programs because many enterprise owners have their payroll administered by their buyers and can't apply for the programs themselves. As I said earlier, due to the seasonal nature of the industry, COVID-19 could cause irreparable harm to our inshore fisheries. Unlike other sectors, we can't hope to recoup our losses later on in the year once we get to whatever our new normal will be. We have a kind of finite amount of time to harvest particular species, and once that time frame has passed, this year will be a loss for many. Most fisheries workers rely on seasonal employment insurance to supplement income during the off season. But for fish harvesters, these EI benefits are based on earnings, not insurable hours. With most harvesters expecting a significant decline in their earnings this year, many are rightfully worried about qualifying for these benefits once the fishing season ends, particularly given that the CERB will no longer be dispersed after October. These realities are not isolated to the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. Fish harvesters across Atlantic Canada and even on the West Coast in British Columbia share similar anxieties about the future of their industry. As a result, organizations that represent fish harvesters have put forward a united voice on these issues. And trust me, unanimity in this industry is hard to come by at times. But we found it and have called on the federal government to do a number of things. And I'd like to kind of go through some of those specific measures. And Rick has already touched on a couple of them. First, extend employment insurance benefits for a 12-month period for all fisheries workers, independent harvesters, crew members, plant workers who qualified for employment insurance in the previous fishing season. This will help to make up for what we expect to be loss in incomes this year. We've also asked the federal government to adapt the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and wage subsidy programs to meet the needs of the fishing sector, to waive and reimburse fees that are related to the commercial fishery for this season, fees like licensing fees, vessel registration, wharf fees. These can amount to thousands of dollars for fish harvesters each season. We've asked the government to introduce a program similar to the Canada Emergency Business Account to address fishing enterprise liquidity issues this year. And finally, we've called for the deferral of payments and freezing of interest on existing bank and provincial loan board loans related to fishing activity for a minimum of 12 months. We believe these measures will help address many of the economic challenges that the fishing industry will face in the next year. In terms of other federal policy that I believe can safeguard the inshore fishery, the new Fisheries Act offers some opportunities. In Newfoundland and Labrador, it's not hyperbole to say that fleet separation and owner-operator policies are two of the most important economic development policies for coastal communities. These policies have kept viable inshore fleets in place and have provided significant wealth to every corner of our province. Many billions of dollars have originated and remained within coastal communities because of owner-operator and fleet separation policies, which have succeeded in widely distributing fishing incomes and play an integral role in our tourism industry, like it does in other parts of Atlantic Canada, sustaining a vibrant social and cultural fabric in rural communities. Unfortunately, there are some who don't see the same value in safeguarding the independent owner-operator fishery and ensuring the wealth of our fish resources flow to their communities. In the past, some corporate interests have influenced or interfered with the application and enforcement of fleet separation and owner-operator policies. And as a result, corporations have gained control of fishing licenses and are siphoning the wealth and benefits of inshore fisheries from our coastal communities. In light of COVID-19, I believe it's more important than ever to enforce these policies, particularly given the economic uncertainty facing fish harvesters who will potentially find themselves in very difficult positions this season and will be vulnerable to companies looking to set up controlling agreements to access inshore fishing licenses. Amendments to the Fisheries Act that were adopted by Parliament last year give these owner-operator policies the force of law. Enforcement will be more robust with legal consequences for corporations holding fish harvesters in controlling agreements. By changing this policy to law, the federal government acknowledged the principle that the inshore fishery should be guided by what's best for independent owner-operators and their coastal communities, not just corporate interests. And this is a principle that we have to protect now more than ever. So just to clue things up, I don't think there's one answer or quick fix to the social, economic, and demographic challenges that we're facing in the inshore fishery, particularly as a result of the pandemic. COVID-19 has laid bare the dire consequences of a system that allows the wealth derived from our natural resources to be concentrated in the hands of a few. Charting a course for social and economic prosperity in this new world will require innovative approaches. The inshore fishery can continue to support working families in coastal communities in Atlantic Canada, but only if people working on the front lines have a seat at the table and are part of the decision-making process. Protecting and promoting a fishery that serves communities, not corporations, that addresses challenges in food security, that provides good wages and safe workplaces. These must be our priorities if we're going to weather the current storm and come out of it with vibrant and sustainable coastal communities and an economy where no one is left behind. I'll leave it at that and pass it along to the next speaker.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Jessica. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much to the McCormick Institute for inviting me. As Kevin introduced me earlier, my name is Geoff Irvine. I'm the Executive Director of the Lobster Council of Canada. The Lobster Council is probably the only organization that has representatives from the entire lobster value chain as part of our board and membership. We represent the harvesting sector, the buyer sector, the processing sector, live shippers, First Nations. We have associate members who supply the industry. So we have really everybody at our table. And after 10 years of operation, working on many, many different issues from quality to branding, our focus today is on the market. Anything that has to do with the market, market access, marketing, promotion, promoting the Canadian lobster brand to the world. So tonight I'm going to focus mostly on the market and the things that we're doing in the Lobster Council to foster that collaboration that Rick talked about as we go through this situation with COVID. Because COVID-19 is dramatically impacting our sector, just like it is every protein sector around the world. And for lobster and most seafood in Canada, it's because we sell most of our seafood in the food service sector. So that would be restaurants all around the world. That would be casinos in America. That would be the cruise ship industry. And we know what's happened to that. So really a dramatic change. And I'll talk a bit about that shortly. It's impacted our market starting in Asia, as we all know, back in the winter, early winter, through Europe and then into North America. And the good news is we're starting to see some recovery in the same order with parts of Asia opening up a little bit, parts of Europe, and then we know what's happening in North America. So I'll talk a bit about that. Our real challenge in the lobster sector is to balance the public health challenges on our fishing boats and in the plants with lobster seasons that are generally short, and processing capacities that are impacted by labor with the returning markets. So that's been our focus over the last really 3 months. We've started having calls about exactly 3 months ago today to try to prepare for this, and all working together from the harvesting sector right up through the industry. So it's important when you talk about the lobster sector to really understand what we are. And we are really two very distinctly different sectors that are interrelated every day, and that's the processing sector and the live shipping sector. The processing sector also has two very distinctively different segments inside the processing sector. One that is focused on doing products like value-added products like lobster tails and meat, value-added products, and the other sector is focused on whole in-shell products. They're quite unique, they're quite different, and they service different markets. And that's about 1.4 billion in export value in 2019. About 55% of the export value is processed products. And the processing industry is concentrated in the Gulf of St. Lawrence region, in New Brunswick and PEI, and the northern shore of Nova Scotia, but also in Quebec. And the other sector is, of course, the live sector. We're in Nova Scotia here, where I'm sitting. Many of our people watching this are in Nova Scotia, and the live sector is centered in the Atlantic side of Nova Scotia, with many live shippers here in Nova Scotia, but also in southwest New Brunswick and other parts of the region as well. About $1.1 billion of export value, many, many different markets, but also Asia, Europe, and North America. And I'm going to fire up my slides and share with you some photos of some of the products that I'm talking about. So you can see these are lobster tails and lobster meat, very, very popular in the US. In the food service sector, which unfortunately has been very much dramatically impacted in the last few months. And I talked about a minute ago I'm trying to advance my slides. This is a lobster bisque and some claws and arms. This is a value-added product as well. I talked about the whole in shell market. These are whole cooked lobster. We also do whole raw, whole blanched. This is a product for many parts of the world, Europe and Asia, but also North America as well. And then we get into live lobster. And of course, live lobster is well known. Many different markets around the world. This is a typical looking live lobster. We sell lobster all over the world. These are some lobsters in a tank in Dubai from a trade mission earlier last year. This is a typical lobster setup in China, where it's a cash and carry wholesale setup where you come in and you pick the lobster you want and it gets sent to your home. So that's kind of what that looks like. The market situation going into this year was really very good, I think, as Rick talked about. We had record shore prices. We had record market prices for all of our processed products, and the live market was very good. We were expecting a very good year again in all of our markets with 2.5 billion in export value last year. Things were looking very good. Of course, then COVID hit. Restaurants around the world closed down. The cruise ship industry was stricken dramatically. And the real challenge we have going into the spring season now is uncertainty. Our customers are uncertain of when their customers will open. Our plants are uncertain about what the prices will be. They're uncertain about their labor force. And so if I could, an underlying theme is uncertainty, and that's dramatically impacting everything that's happening today. And we're also seeing markets recover at different paces, and it's very tough to figure out when that's going to happen. So what we've done in the Lobster Council is really focus on encouraging cooperation and communication within the value chain. So we've been having regular calls, regular meetings. I talk to folks, our members, every day about what's happening in the market, and we've developed what we call the Canadian lobster model to help us try to estimate as markets recover how much lobster we should have flowing through our system. And we do that by analyzing what we landed in lobster last year and the year before, what we processed and what we shipped live, and we put that into a model where we can estimate when is Asia going to recover, when do we think Europe will recover, when do we think North America will recover. And at the end of each week, that spits out a number of what we're calling stranded lobster. And I'm just going to show you. That's a slide that talked about the export value, and I should just touch on that before we go by it. You can see, as Rick talked about, the increased export value. Just in 2017, we were just over 2 billion in export value for lobster. 2019, we were up to almost 2.6 billion. If you look at the numbers more closely, that is mostly because of a dramatic increase in business to China in live lobster and processed lobster. And the other markets are fairly stable, and the US market, we also sold more in the last year. So dramatic increases in the export value. Back to our model. So estimating the stranded lobster, and that's the lobster that doesn't have a home. And it includes lobster that comes from Maine as well, because Canadian plants buy almost half of Maine's lobster in any given year. And so at the end of every week, we come up with a number of what we think will be stranded. And we're sitting right now, if we do everything we did last year, if we fish as hard as we did, if we process, if we ship live, we're estimating that we'll have somewhere around 90 million pounds of stranded lobster at the end of the year. And this graph shows you by month when that would be with the blue line. The red line is, we put in some numbers to estimate if we caught less lobster, if we managed our seasons a little bit, we would have a less amount of stranded lobster. And these numbers change every week as markets recover, and that's the good news, is as markets recover, we will hopefully be able to utilize all the lobster that we can catch. But we've used this data, we've shared it widely with our members, with governments, and I know that many of the harvester groups and the processors have used this data to try to estimate what they should do. And it's very complicated and very challenging, as Rick talked about. There's been a lot of tough calls, a lot of tough meetings as harvesters try to figure out what to do to make their year work, allow them to come out of this year. It's going to be very tough. But this model, we hope, has been helpful, and we share it widely and we adjust it every week. So to sum up, the challenges for the harvester sector, I think Rick and Jessica have talked about them. Public health issues on the boats, given the structure of the industry, how to try to match up supply with the demand. And as markets recover, it's very challenging being able to pay for their licenses and their boats, and really how to survive 2020. Very, very challenging. For the shore side, it's very big issues on public health, on safety in the plants, just as it is on the boats. Big challenge with labor, our temporary foreign workers. We've had some issues bringing them in, and some real sensitivities in some rural communities about having foreign workers in the community. How to finance this year, not knowing what the market's going to be, not knowing if your customers will be there when the season is over, and really how to manage the recovery with all of these variables up in the air. So big challenges for the harvesting sector and the shoreside sector. In terms of wrapping up, as Rick said, this sector is the dominant economic driver in Eastern Canada. The pace of the recovery will determine what policy needs to change or be adjusted or be accommodated for what we need to survive. The Canadian Seafood Sustainability Fund was a good start. It'll help us do some work in our plants. Some of the pillars are more long term, but we think will be helpful if some plants want to retool and focus on retail, for example. That's a possibility. We work with governments every day on marketing strategies, on buy local campaigns. We're working on strategy lobster. In fact, tomorrow, the Grand Canada to encourage people to eat Canadian lobster at home, and we'll be rolling out similar ones in Asia. So to wrap up, markets are recovering at different paces. It's really our job to stay on top of them. We had a call last night with our trade commissioners in China and Hong Kong, and many of our members joined in, from harvesters to shippers and processors and traders. And it was great to get a report right from the people who are living in these markets. And that was important, so that everybody hears the same information, so that we continue to build on the trust. I really believe that people have worked really well together through this crisis, much better than the last one in 2012. And I feel very good about that, because cooperation and collaboration are really vital for us to get through this. And I see it happening. I know it's a very tough year, but I think working together, we will always be victorious and come out of this together. Thanks, Kevin. I think I'm finished.
Thanks. So I'm Susanna Fuller. I work for Oceans North, and we really work hard to support healthy ocean environments and healthy coastal communities. And I am very, I think, emotionally tied to the importance of the fishing industry in Atlantic Canada. I grew up in a rural area where without the fishing industry, we wouldn't have volunteer firefighters, we wouldn't have first responders. So just the vital nature of this industry and in this current crisis is weighing heavily on me. And when it first started, actually, I was trying to figure out how many lobsters Nova Scotians would have to eat per day in order to deal with the growing backlog. And I tried, but my family kind of gave up after day 2 of lobster. But just thinking a lot about the local seafood distribution and local markets, and how we, I guess, how we come out of this crisis. I always think every crisis there's an opportunity. And in this respect, most of my work, and maybe the perspective I'm bringing to this, is the one of conservation. And Rick mentioned in the beginning that in all the food systems we're hearing about, the bulk of French fries, or farmers dumping milk, or the meatpacking plants. I think the unique part about the seafood industry is that we have cold storage going on all the time, and our seafood is stored live in our ocean. And we rely on the ocean to produce that food for us, and for harvesters to harvest it. But we have an interesting opportunity, I think, to maybe give the oceans a break. And I'll just share my screen. Oops, you see it? Try and get to full slideshow here. 1 second. I always like showing pictures of healthy ocean biodiversity, because I think sometimes we forget when we have a lobster on our plate, or a fish and chips, that it comes from a natural ecosystem. So some of the opportunity I see comes from just the, I guess one, the importance of the Atlantic, the marine environment to Atlantic Canada's ocean economy. People feel very, very strongly about this. We did some polling back in September just to get a sense of what people felt was really important about oceans in Atlantic Canada. Definitely a huge contributor to economic and coastal communities. But at the same time, people really felt that there was a lot of threats to the health of the ocean. So plastic, and I think in the days of when we were moving towards no plastic bags and no disposable cups, the amount of plastic waste in the ocean is now probably increasing. And with COVID, we are all using way more plastic than we were before. People are concerned about pollution, people are concerned about climate change, overfishing, impacts of oil tankers, offshore oil and gas. So already Atlantic Canadians had a sense that our oceans were probably not in the best shape. And what I'm going to do is just run through a few graphs that just show the status of a few fish stocks. What we've been talking about, Geoff reviewed lobster and the stats that Rick put up in the beginning showing the value of our fisheries increasing over time really are because of our shellfish industries. It is because of crab and lobster and shrimp and scallop, all of which are really low on the food chain. But I want to show where we are in Atlantic Canada in terms of some of our more important fish stocks that are at incredibly low levels right now. So this is Atlantic mackerel. The red circle is just highlighting how low it is. We're at the lowest level spawning stock biomass since we started recording. Mackerel is incredibly important to the lobster industry for bait. So we're in a situation where mackerel is in the critical zone, landings are way down, egg production is way down. What is this an opportunity, I guess, to maybe give some of our fish stocks a break? And just another one in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, herring and on Scotian shelf herring, again, very low spawning stock biomass, below the limit reference point. I'm not going to get too much into fisheries stock assessment science. But as you can see, these really important stocks, they're not just important for bait, they're important for whales and seabirds, and the entire really marine food chain are at incredibly low levels. And it would be, kind of remiss to talk about Atlantic Canada fisheries without talking about northern cod. Cod, while it has been increasing slowly over the last decade or so, it's still well below the limit reference point. And when you think about fisheries management and the precautionary approach framework, the fisheries management advice is that fishing should be kept to lowest possible levels, which should be 0 when anything is below the critical zone. But we're still fishing cod at quite a high level. And just to show an example of a stock that's increasing, so Atlantic halibut is actually increasing, which is a good news story. When we had the moratorium on groundfish about 20 years ago, halibut was actually kind of given a reprieve. We stopped catching as many juveniles in bottom trawl fishing, and it's increasing, and it's a good news story for groundfish. It's very valuable right now. But at the same time, we have major bycatch in that fishery, and most of the major bycatch is all either considered endangered, threatened, or under special concern by the Committee on Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So on this, again, halibut fishery started. We're not having fisheries observers this year. We don't have any other way to monitor the fishery when it's actually taking place. And so there's a huge, again, a stewardship opportunity that I think can happen. And just going back to how Atlantic Canadians felt, this was in September, there was support for stronger laws and regulation and protecting marine endangered species and creating marine protected areas. At the same time, I think how we do that and have a really active and economically viable fishery is sometimes tricky. When things are good, it's hard to make decisions around conservation. And when things are bad, it's hard to make decisions around conservation. And so I would say, in this situation that we're in right now, we actually have a really interesting opportunity, I think, to reduce what's coming out of the ocean. We don't have to dump fish. It's already in the ocean. We can leave it there. It will be here next year. Geoff's stats on markets and how much will be stranded assets. Those stranded assets and stranded lobsters may actually be better off being stranded in the ocean and reproducing for another year. And I'm not suggesting that we should stop all fishing. I'm suggesting that we should work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the fishing industry and really look at how much we can reduce fishing effort across the board, how much we can maybe extend EI benefits so that people are still able to, buy groceries and live in this time, but also give the ocean a bit of a break. And I think one of the things that we hear a lot is that nature's getting a break. Greenhouse gas emissions are down significantly. People are seeing deer and sheep in odd places. I mean, I myself even put up a bird feeder and I get to see a lot more birds now. India is now finally seeing the Himalayas. And we haven't yet heard about what does this kind of release of human impact and human pressure and human activity do for the oceans, with the exception of some information coming out recently on shipping and reduction of shipping and how that is reducing impacts on marine mammals from a noise perspective. So given the level, the low level of some of our stocks in Atlantic Canada, the real need for fisheries rebuilding, I think one of the most cost-effective ways of bringing some of our forage fish back really may be just having very low quotas this year. But we shall see if that happens, and we'll have to see if there's agreement that we can keep people being able to pay their basic costs and at the same time not fish. I just wanted to run through the importance of seafood in Atlantic Canada. And one thing when we did this polling that I was surprised at actually was that the number of people who felt they had easy access to fresh seafood. And I think we have an interesting opportunity to build more local markets. I'm always shocked that Canadians eat as little seafood as they do. We export 75% of our seafood, and most of the seafood that we eat, like tuna and shrimp and salmon, is imported. So I think there's an interesting opportunity to look at more local distribution systems and more local consumption to deal with the fish that is being fished and is not being exported. And then the other piece I would say is that Atlantic Canadians and Canadians have all supported increased marine protection. And I am an environmentalist and conservationist, but I cannot and will not do my work without working with the fishing industry. The people on the water are the people who experience what's happening out there. At the same time, I'm often going head to head on conservation issues. And in a way, I am wondering if this time where we have a bit of reprieve is not a time for us to sit down and have more concerted discussions around setting aside some areas of our ocean where we're not going to fish, where we are going to allow it to replenish over time into the future. So with that, I'll end just that there's an opportunity, I think, to have healthy oceans that have, rebuilding whale populations, and at the same time, making sure that we are looking forward to the vibrancy of our fishing communities and the role that fishermen and fishing families and fisherwomen all play, particularly in our economy in Atlantic Canada, because it's absolutely vital. And I think without the tourism industry this year, we are going to really be struggling. And so creative ways forward are going to be needed. And I really hope that at the base of them, that the ocean also can benefit. Thank you.
Devin, you're all set.
Great, thanks so much. So I'd ask you to start sending your questions in when you have them. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just start to tee up the conversation a little bit with a few questions of my own before we turn to the questions, though I know I've already received a couple. So just to remind our audience, if you can send in your questions, direct the questions to one person in particular, that would be very helpful. And please try to reduce the use of your acronyms in case our audience is not familiar with all the terms that you might be using. I have a couple of questions, though. I'm going to cheat right away and ask a question of more than one person, but I'm going to start with my first question for Geoff before I get into the kind of sort of secondary question I want to get to. But the first one's for Geoff. Geoff, you talked about, you emphasized the point about different markets recovering at different rates, and this seems to be a key consideration. And you said some of the markets are recovering. So in the spirit of maybe a little bit of good news, what is that recovery what is it starting to look like in terms of the Asian recovery, I guess, that maybe, is there a good news story here? And then how do we sort of think about the potential of a second wave, if there's discussion about what a second wave might look like in the sector? What are you hearing?
Well, about 5 weeks ago, we started to get a renewed interest for live lobster in China. Mainland China was the first to sort of jump back in. We think it's because the inventory that they had for Chinese New Year, they had to either process it in some way so the cupboards were bare. So as soon as there was any interest, they needed product. So there are some charters that go from Halifax 2 or 3 times a week. Air Canada added another one last week to Hong Kong. So we're seeing live lobster return to mainland China. The size breakdown, I think, is a little different. Much of it is going to retail or e-commerce. We had a call last night with a number of trade commissioners, as I said, in China. They all told us basically that the high-end hotels, the high-end restaurants are open but empty. People are still very cautious about going out to eat. And they're also cautious because of the economic situation where many have lost their jobs or they're worried, and the Chinese are savers, and so they are holding back from going out even if they can go out. Everyone's wearing masks. It's going to make the whole dining experience different. So mainland China, also other parts of Asia, we're seeing renewal of interest in South Korea very quickly, Vietnam very quickly. Big challenge there for live lobster is getting there. So as commercial airlines start flying again, that'll be helpful, but these charters are very helpful. We run them, they run from Moncton and Halifax. So that's a bit of good news. And we see that continuing as Asia recovers.
And do you think that recovery then, based on what you said, that the recovery might produce a different kind of a market, a different kind of consumption pattern, or we don't know yet? Or we think when we get on the road to recovery, we're hopefully just going to be back to where we were?
Well, that one, as I said, also, the uncertainty is what the big challenge is. But we also heard last night that there's likely more demand for frozen lobster in China, and growing anyway, because it's shelf stable, because people can store it at home, they can prepare it at home easier, some of the value-added products, for example. So yes, I think we're going to see a different market in the short term. Whether it all goes back to normal after we get through this remains to be seen in every market. I mean, nobody really knows what the food service landscape is going to look like, but we'll just have to see. And folks are going to have to be flexible, but it is impacting for sure. I think some of the sizes, some of the product types for this immediate season.
So thanks for teeing up my next question. And I think I'm going to direct it to the other three. So as I'm going to cheat already. But it seems to me one of the themes that ran through everyone's talk is the need for adaptive capacity. And I guess one of the questions I was wondering as you spoke is this a sector that has inherent adaptive capacity, or is it a sector that really runs on routine? And it's maybe harder for the adaptive capacity. It seemed to me that was a theme that kind of ran through everybody's talk, the need for flexibility. And I'm wondering how much of that is going to have to come from within, and how much is going to have to, that adaptive capacity is going to have to be shored up from others. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I'd be interested to Susanna, Jessica, and Rick's thoughts on that, the capacity for change in the sector.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly. I think because the fishing industry relies on a fundamentally dynamic system like the ocean, it is always ready and necessarily ready for adapting. I mean, fishermen adapt to prices every year, fishermen adapt to quotas and catch levels, fishermen adapt to new regulations. So I actually think it's probably one of the more adaptable industries. But as I think almost everyone said, it's going to take extreme collaboration. And I'm not sure that I think we need to work very quickly to put those collaborative processes in place. And I think some are starting, but I think fishermen are some of the most adaptive. They're essentially still hunters, right? They adapt to weather, they adapt to price at the dock, they adapt to changing regulations all the time. So.
Yeah, I would agree with Susanna. You know, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we went through a massive shift after the cod moratorium and, sought out new species that could be valuable to make up incomes. And since that time have really relied upon a lot of shellfish species. And even in the past few years, lobster has become something that has made a huge difference in incomes for fish harvesters in a lot of areas in this province where we've seen other stocks decline. So I do think that it is an incredibly adaptive industry. And even from year to year, some of the regulations and policy changes that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans introduces around, marine mammals, for example, in the past couple of years, these changes have come pretty quickly. And while harvesters do push back from time to time, for the most part, they're adapting really quickly to these new changes. So I agree with Susanna. I think we do have that capacity and are quite dynamic.
Rick?
I guess I would draw a sharp contrast between what goes on in different provinces, different regions. I've been preoccupied for many, many years with the issue of fish harvester organization, the harvesting sector organization. So you now have a situation where in Newfoundland, you have one organization that can sit down with government, that can sit at tables with processors, can be a part of strategies and plans, as is happening with the rebuilding of the cod fishery, can do long-term planning and organize the members of that organization to be a part of a discipline about how we're going to go about things, and that organization plays a major role in the development of fisheries plans. But when you get into the Maritimes, you have a very much a mixed bag. And I think what we're seeing right now in the lobster fishery, particularly in Nova Scotia, is a kind of a chaos at the wharf level, at the community level, with different lobster fishing areas and different harvest organizations having different agendas. There isn't a governance structure. There isn't a table where people really are kind of disciplined into sitting down and working out an industry strategy that works best for everyone. And so that's a real concern. I think a major failure of both government and industry leadership in the Maritimes in not coming up with systems of governance and industry representation that are effective we've had 10 really good years in which everyone's been happy and getting along nicely. And then something like this hits and we see the fissures and the fault lines very clearly.
Okay, I've got some questions rolling in. I think this first one maybe is for you, Jessica, and it's from Melanie. It's a reference to owner-operator enterprises, and you made reference to that. So how should the government, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, prepare to protect owner-operator enterprises, particularly licenses, if financial difficulties cannot be resolved through a dedicated COVID subsidy package for the fishing industry? If we are to preserve the owner-operator and the valuable contribution it makes in our coastal community, some steps will and are needed. I think that's for you, Jessica. Maybe you disagree.
No, it sounds like it's for me. Unless anybody else wants to jump in, you can feel free. Yeah, I think that this dedicated package for fish harvesters is particularly important. I don't want to let go of that point because we've seen over the past few weeks a number of programs rolled out by the federal government that will, for the most part, just benefit processing companies. But at the same time, organizations, fishing organizations across the country for the past number of years have been putting forward this concerted effort to push the federal government to do more enforcement of owner-operator policies. And so some of that was enshrined in the Fisheries Act, which was adopted last year. But the kind of operational side of things is ensuring that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has the resources to actually do investigations to look into the financial arrangements and controlling agreements that are constructed between fish processing companies and fish harvesters. And up until now, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans hasn't really done a great job of investigating those arrangements. They haven't followed the money, so to speak, to see who is actually benefiting from the fishing licenses. If it's not the fish harvester whose name is on the license, then that should point the department to the direction of a corporation that might be benefiting. So having the federal department have the resources to be able to actually enforce those policies will be important, whether or not subsidies or compensation comes through for fish harvesters. But even more so because they're vulnerable because of the pandemic. People are worried about making loan payments. They're worried about their incomes to support their families. And it's a time where people could be ripe for companies to swoop in and say, hey, let's set up this arrangement where you fish this license, but I'm really the one that's going to benefit in the end. So both of those things need to happen at the same time. But I know fish harvesters across the country have been really frustrated with the federal government that nothing direct has been announced yet that will actually support them, and have been told kind of to wait, and these benefits to processing companies will trickle down and help them, and that really isn't enough.
Okay, I have a question. It's actually for the regulator, but I'm going to throw it out anyway because somebody asked it, and I will see who wants to take it. It's a question from Cassie, and it says, why has a delay been put in place for only certain lobster fishing areas? These delays have meant we've lost the first 2 weeks of our season where we see our highest catch. We've lost Mother's Day market, and it fails to allow the deckhands to have the full season of work in order for them to qualify for unemployment benefits.
I can take a stab at that one, Kevin.
Thanks.
from my understanding, some of the harvesting groups in the Gulf principally came together and proposed a delay in response to some of the processors and the shoreside interest asking for that, because the plants need more time to prepare their plants with PPE and with adaptations for inside the plants. And they also, as I said earlier, the market is so uncertain that any delay that's possible potentially could help the plants with their market, which could potentially help the harvesters with the shore price. So that's a short answer about why some chose to do what they did. I would say in a bigger scheme, in a bigger picture, a comment that every harvester group, every association were scrambling for weeks and weeks and weeks, trying to put the information they had and try to figure out how best to make their season work. And for some, the decisions perhaps weren't the best, and for some, maybe they were. But the challenge is that this is so complicated, the recovery is so hard to predict. There are so many variables at place that any decision that anybody made could have been good, it could have been bad, but they wouldn't have known. And that's frustrating for their members. It's frustrating for people. But all I can say is I know that the associations did the best they could with the information they had.
Okay. This is from Daniel, and it's for Rick, I believe. Yeah, it's for Rick. In some industries like groceries and deliveries, there's a suggestion that the value of essential workers will be reassessed and changed significantly. Rick, do you see any changes coming in the relative value of labor in our fisheries?
Not sure I understand where that question is going. Certainly the industry has been defined by the minister and others as an essential service sector because it's food producing, even though in many parts of the fishery we're producing food for other countries more than domestically, but that could change. It'll be interesting to see how this, as it plays out, how this gets managed around the processing sector, particularly whether companies are able to sustain labor forces and maintain production levels. Geoff would know more about that than I would. Not sure if that's answering the question clearly, though.
Could I jump in on this one too, Kevin?
By all means. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, no, I think just from, I guess, the bigger picture, there is this question of how we value labor and which workers are deemed essential that I think we're analyzing a lot more closely as a society. Not to get too big picture on it, but I think from my perspective of dealing with fish plant workers in Newfoundland and Labrador, they felt in many cases like they're expendable. And so not only are they looking for better health and safety measures in their plants, but some are saying like, what we're getting paid is not enough if we're considered to be essential. And how can we improve wages for those workers who are on the front lines and providing food that people eat here in Canada and around the world? So I think in that sense, I hope as a society, we're shifting our view of what essential work is and how much we value labor, not to mention how we treat, migrant workers and temporary foreign workers. And oftentimes they're the folks who are exploited the most, but also are so integral to our industries, particularly fish processing and other parts of Atlantic Canada. We don't have as many temporary foreign workers in Newfoundland and Labrador fish plants as in other places. But certainly I hope there's a closer look at the value of their labor as well.
I mean, I think on this point, I agree with you. I think there's a big conversation coming on the other side of this about what constitutes an essential service. So I do a lot of work in emergency management, emergency response myself. And I think there are many sectors where there were kind of broad categories used about what constitutes, the critical infrastructure of our society. But it's when it came down to making decisions about, who's critical, who's not, what criteria were they using, and should they use that criteria? I think like a lot of things, they happen quickly, and I think there'll be a big conversation afterwards. I think it's been a surprise to some people about what is essential and what isn't, and how do we treat those people who are deemed essential. I think there is a big conversation coming up the other side of this. I agree. Just maybe keeping on this point, Jessica, this is from Sherry on Facebook. Has there been any discussion on proper PPE on a fishing vessel? How will fish harvesters keep their masts dry?
Yeah, so and I'll speak to Newfoundland and Labrador, and maybe some other folks can talk about what's happening in other parts of Atlantic Canada. But I know here in this province, we've been working really closely with the Newfoundland and Labrador Fish Harvesting Safety Association, which is an organization that is formed by the provincial government and is led in large part by fish harvesters. And they've, over the past about a month or so, have been developing safe operating procedures for fishing vessels. And like I said, it's really difficult and nearly impossible in some cases to do proper social distancing or physical distancing, aboard a 30-foot boat. But there's been a pretty significant discussion about proper masks, for example. If you're out, on the water in the North Atlantic and there's seawater in your face, a lot of masks aren't really going to do the job. A surgical mask is probably not going to be much use to you. A visor of some sort is not going to be useful either, because you still kind of have to do your work. So there's been some discussion around alternative types of face masks that can, protect harvesters as much as possible. But what we've found to be the most useful measure is to encourage people to self-isolate for 14 days prior to going aboard the vessel, to stay in their bubble with their family, and then to return to that bubble afterwards to try to mitigate, having anybody come aboard a boat that may have COVID, and then doing everything they can to ensure there's distancing aboard, and looking at alternative types of masks that can actually sustain, being out on the water. So it's nothing is going to be a perfect fit, and we're encouraging people to do the best that they can, because I don't think there's one standard operating procedure that's going to work aboard every fishing vessel. Right.
So this is a question for Jessica or Geoff, and I'm not sure who would like to take the first stab at it. It's from Aaron on Facebook. In the agricultural industry, temporary foreign workers are being quarantined for 2 weeks on farms before they start work. The federal government is helping farmers financially to house these quarantine workers. Is such a thing possible for temporary foreign workers in the seafood processing industry? That's for Geoff or Jessica.
Take that. Any come into a lobster plant quarantine for 14 days. And I believe Ag Canada has a program that helps actually the processors pay for that time, because the workers have to be paid through that time. So it's the same in seafood as it is in the ag sector.
Okay. A question from Rosie for Susanna. Can you expand on the opportunity to give fisheries a break? Do you see this as a unique conservation opportunity that we wouldn't otherwise encounter?
I do. I think, Jessica's talked a lot about the new Fisheries Act that came in force in June 2019. And one of the pieces of that act is actually to rebuild fish stocks. It's the first time we've had a legal obligation to rebuild fish stocks. And in the minister's mandate letter from last December, there's also one of the mandates is to rebuild fisheries and to implement the Fisheries Act. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities. I think it would have to be on a fishery by fishery basis, but you could look very specifically at quotas where we don't think the full capacity of the fishery is going to be able to fish, and reduce those quotas accordingly. I think it would have to be done hand in hand with the fishing industry, of course, because you need to not have opposition to that quota reduction. But absolutely, I think there's a big opportunity to kind of, as I said, give fisheries a break, and the fish will be there next year. I've often heard fishermen say, well, we can't leave fish in the water. And I think this is a really interesting time to do some experimenting with what happens if you do leave fish in the water. They will be there to reproduce for next year. And I'm not sure from a market perspective if it's worth taking fish out of the water if we don't have a good price for them. So huge opportunity. I think managing fisheries is in the best of times a wicked problem. Managing fisheries in a crisis is even more difficult. But I think with some strong leadership, both from the fishing industry and the minister's office, that this is possible for sure.
So on that point, then I got a question from Maria via email for Jessica. How does FFAW feel about giving the oceans a break for 1 year? What would be the differences between your members, harvesters, and processing workers?
Easy question to answer. I think to Susanna's point, obviously fish harvesters are invested in conservation of our oceans and ensuring that there's a sustainable fishery there for them years down the road. And I think the most important thing is trying to strike a balance, or just find some balance around the economics of it as well. And I think that kind of brings us back to this point around direct federal support for fish harvesters. If quotas are going to be reduced, or if fisheries are going to be delayed delayed or maybe not even open this year, how do we ensure people are able to support their families, to put, you know, food on their dinner table, and to pay their bills, and not to mention the, you know, really significant loans that a lot of fish harvesters have. For us, I think that it's just trying to strike that balance and ensure that we're doing the work to manage fisheries sustainably, but in this case also ensuring there's federal support for people who are going to need it either way this year, because it's just going to be a challenging year. And then for plant workers, I don't want to leave them out of the equation either. You know, many have been eligible for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, but like fish harvesters, you know, that only lasts so long, and those folks also rely on seasonal employment insurance. So if they don't have, you know, the insurable hours that they need, they're going to be seeing a significant reduction in their incomes this year, and those jobs obviously pay a lot less, and you know, people are not. People are living on limited means, I think, in that sector, and will need support. So we have to find a balance between conservation and supporting the economics in coastal communities. And it's not an easy one to answer.
Sure. Okay. This is for Geoff from Tom on Facebook. Is there any breakdown in how much of the $3.5 billion goes to large corporations, and what percentage to small participants and communities? And how has this been changing over time?
I don't know what 3.5 billion he means.
The value of the sector, the fisheries in the Atlantic region. I think that was the number we might have quoted at the beginning.
Okay. Well, Rick had some good slides on kind of how it breaks down if you do the math. I mean, we did some research several years ago that shows that you know, generally the harvesting sector receives 75 to 80% of the export value in the live lobster sector, and it changes over the years, but without knowing what he means, if what he means is who gets what, then that's the number that I think is fairly accurate. In the last number of years, we've had some really strong years for shore prices and market prices, and I think it's very much in that range. 75 to 80%. On the processing side, it's a little less, but it's very close to that as well. Yeah, I mean, what keeps that very level is competition on the shore. Every lobster buyer needs the lobster that he buys from the boats that he works with, or he doesn't have a business. So there's fierce competition on the shore for lobster, and before COVID-19, there's been fierce competition in the market. So that keeps the sharing very regular and at a good level.
A question for Susanna from Melina on email. Cost was very large in the case, let's see, it's about, this cost was very large in the case of the cod moratorium that was used as an example by the panelists to describe how resilient the industry is. Additionally, the collapse affected fishers disproportionately. Do you see any inequalities emerging from the effects of COVID-19? For example, already disadvantaged groups such as Indigenous communities, some of which are in the process of establishing access rights, may be affected more severely. How do we address such inequalities within the fishing industry?
Well, I think to some of Jessica's points, addressing inequalities is an ongoing, it's ongoing in the fishing industry. I think, you know, I've been reading a lot about COVID impacts, and in some cases, it's actually given that so many people are impacted by COVID and so many people are not working across the board, across all kinds of jobs. It's an interesting time to start to discuss equalities and inequalities. I think there, you know, from an Indigenous fisheries perspective, I do totally agree that, you know, the reconciliation agenda was, you know, getting its feet and figuring out what that meant in terms of future Indigenous fisheries. Really important for the labor force. You know, as Rick mentioned, we have a declining labor force. There's a huge opportunity there for Indigenous fishers. I'm not sure what it means exactly. And I think in terms of basic food access, you know, the food, social, and ceremonial fisheries that Indigenous communities have access to are really a really good thing right now. So I think, you know, it remains to be seen. I think we don't know what the fishing industry is going to look like when we come out of this, but I don't think we've lost those opportunities to make sure that we are reconciling with First Nations and Indigenous fishers over time. I think it's a very complicated question in the time of COVID and in not. But I think there are opportunities to discuss how we start to equalize across the fishing industry, given that this is a public resource, right? Fish are the one public resource we still harvest. And that is a ongoing discussion that I think maybe we can have dig deeper into during this time.
Right. I have a question from Wilf, an email, and it's he's asked a couple. It's for Jessica or Geoff, and he's illustrated a couple examples. But I'm just going to strike it this way. I think he's asking about the various issues across the supply chain and striking some balance between, the economic imperatives and the health imperatives, which seem to be held in tension. And I wonder if you can just comment a little bit on how we strike an appropriate balance between the two, or the things that are on your mind about striking this balance between the economics and health of this issue.
Are you talking about the health of fish stocks or health and safety?
No, health and safety. Health and safety. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest issue that we've been grappling with for the past, well, since this pandemic began, at least from FFAW's perspective. And it's really weighed heavily on a lot of the elected leadership within our union, the fish harvesters who represent their communities, who are trying to get together and discuss whether or not they should recommend we delay fisheries, or whether or not they should go forward and trying to decide between earning a paycheck and potentially opening up your really small rural community to the risk of spreading COVID-19. I think that is hugely challenging. And then from the fish processing side of things, as I've already said a couple of times, I think, fish plant workers are incredibly hardworking people who work in difficult conditions, who have, in some cases, pre-existing respiratory conditions that would make them more vulnerable to COVID-19. So, we have to try to represent these concerns to processing companies when we're talking to them about, we talk to them about fish prices, obviously, but also about the safe operating procedures in fish plants. So, I think that's why we have put so much effort into reaching out to the federal government and asking how are they going to directly support fish harvesters so that we can protect health and safety and also protect incomes. And in some cases, fisheries will start, in a week. Some have started already here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and people are doing everything they can to be safe because they've decided that it's the right time to start fishing. But for others, they don't feel the same level of safety. So how do we support those people? It's been a very difficult thing to navigate over the past month.
And I would just fill in, I agree with everything Jessica said. Our harvester members have the same concerns. On the shore side, though, I can also confirm 100% that many of the plants are very worried about an outbreak. I mean, you just have to look at the meat industry in Western Canada and the US to see how susceptible these plants are to outbreaks. So they're very worried. They're all in generally smaller communities. They're very concerned about that. But I guess one other good thing, if there's a good thing, and I know for some folks it makes no sense at all, but a delay does help us have less cases in our region. Every day that we go by where we have less COVID cases in these small towns means less of a risk in the plants and on the boats of people getting the virus. And so that is another reason to delay as long as we can. But very, very big concern in many of these plants as well.
Just on that point, Geoff, I wonder, to what extent do you think this problem, though, is a problem that, there are certain things we can control here, but largely this is a problem that exists elsewhere, and we have to really wait for that American market to bounce back, the Chinese market to bounce back, the European market to bounce back. There's only so much we're really going to be able, we do the best we can be the best students we can be, but at the end of the day, we have to wait for this global economy to bounce back.
Well, I think that was Rick's really key point, is that the industry relies on our market, and the markets are absolutely vital. And we do a fantastic job. We're one of the world's leaders in fisheries management, in food safety, in our plants, in sustainability. We're held in high regard around the world. Our brand of Canadian seafood is very, very good for all those reasons. So we are absolutely at the mercy of our markets, and there's not one thing we can do about it. So we have to wait, we have to hope, we have to do the right thing at home, because our domestic market is still an important market. And we have to, those key markets, especially America, when America starts going back to restaurants, we can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief.
Rick, I wonder if you might just comment on the dynamics between the provincial governments, knowing that you were in this position, the provincial governments and the federal government, and whether part of the coordination is characterize that relationship and what needs to happen in that relationship to make this more successful, our outcomes more successful.
Well, historically, the relationship has been one of kind of passing the buck, right? Where provincial governments have made very weak commitments to developing their fisheries. The exception to that, again, would be Newfoundland and Labrador, I think. But where, it's never been, I certainly found in my time in the Nova Scotia government, despite a strong commitment to rural development, that the fishery was not really seen as an integral and strategic part of the economy. So the leadership isn't there often from the provincial level. Although there are meetings of ministers and so on, but there isn't a governance structure that brings everybody, federal and provincial and industry, to a table to develop vision and strategy around a situation like this. I would add, just in relation to previous comments, over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, fishermen have been earning solid middle-class incomes across the Atlantic region in the fishery, fish harvesters and crew and captains and so on. It's a transformation of our rural economy, rural coastal economy in particular, that's taken place because of this dynamic market situation. And so it's, what is frustrating me and challenging me right now is, can we get a recognition of that reality and a commitment to sustaining that through, that we have to survive this current year and maybe year and a half. I think Geoff sounds more optimistic than I have been leading into this. So I'm glad to hear the story of the recovering markets, but it's going to take a really concerted effort by industry, government, federal and provincial together to get us through this, so that we have a strong fishing industry coming out the other side. And we're not seeing that yet. There's a lot of work to be done. And we haven't got the tables where the decision makers from the federal, and because the fishery is a divided jurisdiction, the provinces handle what happens on the land, the federal government handles what happens in the water. Until we get serious decision-making people around the table together to decide, okay, how are we going to come out the other side of this stronger and ready to grow again? That's not happening yet.
Do you think the impulse, though, is now? This is one of the opportunities that comes out of this kind of event?
I'm not seeing anyone sees
some sort of institutional changes. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to think about is the institutional changes that come about because of COVID-19. What are the lasting institutional changes that might come about?
Well, I'm not seeing that happening yet. I mean, I'm not sitting in ministers' offices, and so I'm not hearing what's going on there. But and again, maybe Geoff or Jessica are more aware of conversations that are going on than I am. But the one place where I'm hearing real interest in something like this, a governance shift, is at ACOA, because I think they have recognized the economic significance of the industry and are prepared to invest in it. But I'm not hearing those kind of public signals so far anywhere else. And again, I think, in relation, the major thing that's happening at the wharf level, at the community level right now is uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds anxiety, and to some extent doesn't lead to good decision making and so on. The role of government, as we're seeing across the whole COVID crisis, is to bring in certainties around people have incomes, businesses have capacities to stay in business, the health priority is going to be sustained, etc. We're seeing that happen in other industry sectors. We're seeing it happening at the kind of macro level of the economy and so on. We're not seeing it yet in the fishery. And until that happens, I don't think we're going to see better decision making at the industry level, with the exceptions of the examples we've heard about tonight in Newfoundland and elsewhere.
I know that we're at time, but I want to just ask the other three, if I may, Rick, just maybe a 10-second, 20-second reflection on some sort of lasting, hopeful impact that maybe the COVID-19, an issue that's brought into focus that we can address, or something you're hoping will come out of this learning opportunity, or some outcome that might be something for us to look forward to as some sort of possible optimistic note to end our panel on. Who wants to go first on that?
I'll go. I would say this has shown us that we really have to make sure we have a diversified market. We have to have a diversified market in terms of what we sell into, retail and food service and e-commerce. We've been way too reliant on food service. We need to make sure we're diversified there. And it's also showing us, playing up on what Rick just said in the question you asked him, that We as an industry do not advocate for ourselves effectively. We're very fragmented. We don't invest in ourselves so that we can advocate with governments. We have to improve that.
Jessica or Susanna?
I guess I'll go. I think that more coordination across the industry is just absolutely necessary. I know there are some tables where people are coming together, but it's really just to try to come up with very short-term measures that will help people weather this storm. And so I guess my one optimistic note will be around improving working conditions and occupational health and safety, and really kind of taking seriously some of the long-standing issues we've been facing, particularly in fish plants over the past number of years, and doing more to raise the bar when it comes to health and safety and wages for people that are actually working in the industry. I think that that's crucial coming out of this.
Susanna?
So I think one thing that's definitely coming out of this is the essential nature of our fisheries and our food supply, and access to protein and having diverse access to protein. I think the challenges in some of the food processing plants in the West have really highlighted that. I think the importance of the fishing industry to our economy in Atlantic Canada, I think it has never been more salient, I guess. And then finally, I think, just the fact that we're having this conversation, and thanks to you for convening it, but I think that this conversation with a few more players at the table needs to be had on a weekly basis going forward. And the minister actually has the power to convene panels to advise on very specific things under the new Fisheries Act. That's what should be happening now. So I see that as an opportunity that hasn't been seized, but I do think that the fact that we're having these conversations with diverse interest is really great, and much more needs to be done.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm sorry to our audience if I didn't get to your questions. I got to as many as I could. We actually got quite a few questions in. So I would encourage you to send your question along to one of our panelists at their email address, and they will hopefully get back to you with a thoughtful and timely response. Thanks again for joining us tonight. We'll be on again next Tuesday, a panel on tourism and the impact on tourism as a result of COVID-19. Thanks to our panelists for all your thoughtful views. Very stimulating discussion. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it. I certainly did. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you again next Tuesday. Thank you.